Okay, in this 7th video, unfolding the teachings of the process Enneagram, we'll take a look at the journey of a bean plant. This is another metaphor that we can use for understanding the process Enneagram and also seeing how the process Enneagram relates to the personality Enneagram. And if you're interested in these teachings in more detail, you can go to my website, livingenneagram.com, where you'll find a little bit more about these teachings I'm just going to introduce in this video. So the process Enneagram, here are my names for the different points. Just kind of outlining it generally. Remember that the process Enneagram relates to 9 stages in the universal process, meaning we are all moving through these stages. All the personality types are moving through all 9 steps, no matter what personality type you are in the personality Enneagram. And so this process is a process that is universal. All processes of transformation can be mapped onto the Enneagram according to the Enneagram tradition and its teachings. So we're going to do that with the process of the life cycle of a bean plant, which is something that all, say, United States 4th graders in a public school would be doing, is looking at and experimenting with how a seed becomes a bean plant. And here I've got a little bit more detail. I sometimes put a couple more words associated with each point in the process just to give you a sense of some of the nuances in these processes. So this is a fuller iteration of the process Enneagram, 9 stages. And here we have the life cycle of a bean. So I'm going to move through this, and so you get a sense of it. So at point 1 in the process, we have a seed, and that seed contains the potential. You could see the original intention for a bean plant. And that seed needs to be planted in a proper amount of soil that has got proper nutriment and proper moisture, not too deep, not too shallow, and so forth. So it has to have the proper conditions for getting started correctly. And once it's planted at point 2, the seed gets some resources. It gets water, gets moisture from the soil. And this uptake of water expands the bean, and so certain things and enzymes get activated within the bean, and the bean expands. And if it's got too much water, it will drown. It will actually suffocate in the water, and so it has to be properly planted. But if it's got the right amount of resources, the seed starts to expand, and these enzymes get activated. And then at point 3, which is our first shock point, the seed, something happens, something from the outside occurs. We don't really know how this happens. The seed comes to life. Turns out that even dead seeds at point 2 can take on water. So the fact that the seed's taking on water doesn't mean that it's alive. The seed quickens. There's a part in the seed called the radicle that quickens, and it comes to life at point 3. And it responds to the environment by breaking out of the seed, the radicle, and responding to the environment to start to root down. So that at point 4, it's rooting down to find more water so that it can continue the process of growth. And then at N, this is the nadir of the Enneagram, the seed dies. The seed completely dissolves. Now the seed, there's a food source also in the seed that's being used up by the root as it's rooting down, and by what's called the shoot, which is at point 5. It's shooting up to find a new source of energy. So what's also happening at the nadir of the Enneagram for the life cycle of the bean is quite interesting. It turns out that in the seed are all of these sort of cells that are all the same. They're all cells of potential, kind of embryonic cells, if you will. So they could be anything, but they're all the same. And at the nadir of the Enneagram, the cells start to differentiate. So as the seed is dissolving and dying, all the cells become differentiated, so that some cells will eventually become flowers, and some cells will eventually become stems, and others will become leaves, and others will become roots, and so forth. So there's a specialization that happens, a differentiation that happens with the death of the seed. And that differentiation happens at point 5 to have some cells that are very attuned to, very sensitive to light waves, and to then be able to follow and track light coming down through the soil. And so the shoot is starting to move up through the soil, and it's protected by a seed coat. So there's a very hard protective coating to these very sensitive, almost gelatinous kind of cells underneath that are guiding the shoot going up to find light, because the seed is running out of energy, its food storage, or the plant is running out of the food storage in the original seed. It needs to find new energy, namely light. This happens at the point 6, where the shoot becomes a sprout. It comes out of the shell encasing and is literally sort of pulled up by the sunlight. So it's a kind of surrendering to the light, where it finds all kinds of new energy in the process of photosynthesis, which is how a seed, or a young plant rather, gets its food and energy, is through sunlight, through photosynthesis. And at 7, the plant, it becomes a young plant. Here it flowers, it comes to new life. There's a sort of youthfulness, vitality to the plant. And this is the point of reproduction, or the plant pollinates either within itself, or it cross-pollinates with other plants nearby. And so there's an exchange of information and the kind of new infusion of information in the process of new growth and creation of new seeds through this process of reproduction at 7. And in 8, these new seeds are in their own pods. And so we have bean pods where the seeds are being stored, and we have the full maturation of the plant. Now the plant is fully mature. Also, it turns out at 8, the pods literally explode with a pop. So there's a popping noise that happens as the seeds explode out of the pods. And then at 9, the plant dies and it becomes part of the ground, part of the soil, gets integrated back into the soil. Meanwhile, the seeds are dispersed by the energy of something else. An animal carries it, or water carries it, or the wind carries it. Some other source of energy carries the seeds off into dispersal, which then creates the conditions for some of these seeds anyway to begin the process again at point 1. So that is roughly the life cycle of a bean plant in the 9 stages of the Enneagram. And so what I've got here is a chart where all of these are charted. So we can see the 9 stages along with the 9, with all these different points in the process of the journey of the bean plant. The light blue is representing the shock points, so that the shell breaking is a shock point. It's an infusion of something into the process that's critical for the process to continue, and it's a breaking of the shell. Similarly, the plant sprout is breaking the soil, and it's coming out of its encasing. So there's a kind of breaking through that happens there, but at the point 6, it's about surrendering to something greater, in this case, the light. And then finally, the dispersal of the seeds as the plant dies at 9. And all of these are also interrelated along the connecting lines, just like the meal preparation metaphor. So that, for example, the seed at point 1, when it gets planted, it needs to find exactly the right depth for the process to then continue on with the rooting down to find more water. So it has to have just the right amount of planting and intention for those roots and that watering to be successful, as well as the fact that the seed in the original intention at 1 becomes sort of realized at point 7, where the seed fully flowers and fully blossoms. And so the original intention is fulfilled at 7. So there's a connecting line between 1 and 7. And also the flowering and the reproduction is what creates new seeds. So we have another connection between 7 and 1 in that way. And so on around the Enneagram, all of the connecting lines also relate to relate each of the stages of the points to each other. And you can see more of this on livingenneagram.com. Here is a chart that I'll include with the handouts associated with the video, which talk a little bit more about how the journey of the bean plant represents a universal process. So we can start to see the qualities of the stage of each process. So it's not just about the bean plant, we're seeing more of a universal journey. And I use the metaphor of journey. So I've got this person journeying here. So for example, the point 1 in any stage represents potential growth. It's the beginning of the journey. And the beginning of the journey in any process will impact the way that the journey unfolds. So it's best to start with ideal conditions. And in the case of the journey of the bean plant, it's about planting the seed properly within the soil with just the right conditions. And so this is why point 1 in any process represents the outset of the journey, and making sure that that initial stroke, that initial impression, that initial intention is solid enough and powerful enough to carry one through the process, and so on around the Enneagram. So what I've got in this slide is a reminder that the personality Enneagram of the 9 types relates to the 9 stages of the process Enneagram, such that, of course, all of the 9 types are going through all of the 9 stages, but each stage in the process relates to the qualities and the characteristics of each of the 9 types. So, for example, if we take point 1, the point of first impression of intention, it relates to the qualities of the type 1, the perfectionist reformer. It turns out that type 1s are very attuned to first impressions. In fact, they're most perfectionistic around starting out a project. They want to make sure it starts out correctly. And so ones are very big on setting the space, making sure that right relations and things are properly aligned and ordered for a process of growth to occur. And it can actually get thwarted in this growth process or stunt this process if they get too perfectionistic around starting something. Similarly, ones are very attuned to core values within themselves. They're trying to align their conduct with core values that they hold dearly, core values of an organization. Ones might be the ones that are talking about what are our core values, or what's the core protocol here? How can we align using that protocol, align our conduct with our core values? All of this relates to the initial intention, the initial beginning of the journey. So ones are very in tune with first impressions and initial intentions, the type 1 personality style. So here I've got a chart which relates the process Enneagram to the personality Enneagram, the qualities of intending and impressing, for example, with 1 in the process. Those are the stages. The first stage in the process relate to the perfectionist reformer type pattern in the personality Enneagram. And here's a little bit of a description of how those two relate, and it goes through all of the 9 types, so you get a feel for that and how they begin to relate to one another. And so we can really get to an understanding of each of the personality styles more as we get to an understanding of these stages in the universal process of transformation. And one of the ways I do this is through my teachings on the Hero's Enneagram. Using Joseph Campbell's famous Hero's Journey, we can map that onto the Enneagram, and we can get a sense of the stages of the universal process and the qualities of the 9 personality styles as they relate to those stages. Look for those teachings among my offerings, and you'll see a video series on the Hero's Enneagram. Similarly, I've got one on the Cosmic Enneagram, and this one's much more detailed than the Hero's Enneagram. Turns out, really interestingly, that the life cycle of a star, the birth and the death of a star, can be mapped onto the Enneagram, onto the process Enneagram. And so the Cosmic Enneagram goes through using a little bit of the science of each of these stages and introducing you to the science of it, and then using some of that science to get a sense of the qualities of each of the 9 personality styles. It's a really fun way to really get an understanding of what these personality styles are doing on an energetic level. It's a really good way to learn them. And that's also among my offerings. It's another way of using something concrete to describe both the process Enneagram and the personality Enneagram and the relationship between the two. So I hope you can enjoy those. And that ends this segment of the teachings on the process Enneagram.